Absolutely.
My grandmother. Okay.
So what made the Seminoles very important is the fact that of all the native tribes in the United States, they were comprised of Cherokees from the east, Upper and Lower Creeks from Alabama and Georgia, Miccosukes, Muskogees, but more importantly, and what most people don't understand, there were African American Seminoles. These were blacks who were escaping chattel slavery throughout the South, would then come across the Seminoles, who then would accept them as part of their tribe. When it comes to Seminoles, what made them different was ideology. They were looking at settling down and creating communities. They were looking at scientific farming, rather than be like most native tribes who would hunt, fish, and move on to a new area. The Seminoles themselves were deeply involved in wanting to, I guess, assimilate more into some of what is considered culture at the time, meaning communities, farming, and all that. And here in Florida, as they moved in, those blacks who were escaping slavery were looking for a better life for themselves. And as long as they were interested in assisting in farming and creating these communities, they began to openly be accepted in Seminole culture. So what you have for one of the first times is a history where true diversity is occurring. You have the escaped slaves who now become Native Americans. They dress as them, they talk as them. And this map is an interesting map because it's going to show you, in relation to the rest of Florida, we are located between this place called Chocochatty and the Cove of the Withlacoochee, or today we call Wahoo Swamp. Now, 5 miles south of us is Chocochatty. This is a Seminole town that is believed to have had 2,000 to 2,500 Seminoles living there as early as the late 1700s into the 1830s. That makes it the largest settlement of Seminoles anywhere in North America, and that is only 5 miles away from us. 10 miles north, the Wahoo Swamp was the spiritual center of the Seminoles in the area, where they would worship, where they would dance and celebrate. And due east of us is a battlefield, which is today the Dade Battlefield State Park in Bushnell, where the first battle of an almost 7-year war was fought. The United States Army was building a series of forts throughout Florida in the 1830s to enforce the removal of Seminoles in the area. These Seminoles were initially offered a trade of their land in Florida for land out west in Arkansas. They had an agreement that would give them 20 years to settle their affairs and move. Well, the government, being who they are, came in after 9 years and said, you have to leave now. So the natives were not happy about this situation, and to prove a point, they attacked 108 soldiers along what was then called the Fort King Road. Today is Highway 301. But 108 soldiers, all but 3 were killed. This was major national news of a native group attacking the army. This is very much like Vietnam was in our 1960s and 70s. An indigenous people fighting to save their homes against a big government. Now, that was December 1835. This battle started a war that lasted almost 7 years into 1842. The beginning of this war, there were 5,000 Seminoles. Of that number, there's an unknown number of black Seminoles, but we believe anywhere from 100 upwards to 400. That is a very large number when you consider that they're escaped slaves. This, not to put a dollar value price, that this is expensive business propositions for these white slave owners. So they're going to work every way they can to recover those enslaved people working for them, while the Seminoles fought to keep them, who they now consider brothers and sisters. It made these African American warriors, fierce warriors. They are literally fighting for their lives. If they were captured, they're put back into chattel slavery. So who do you think is going to fight as hard or harder than someone who's fighting literally for their lives and their liberty? So for this almost 7-year war, the beginning, there's almost 5,000 Seminoles. Less than 200 remained in all of Florida, and most of them were deep down in the Everglades where nobody wanted. So what happened to those 5,000? They were captured and sent initially to Arkansas and later Oklahoma. They were sickness and disease. Or you're part of the 200 that remained down in the Everglades, and amongst them were African Americans as well. In 1842, the federal government then is trying to decide what to do with all this land that's here, all throughout Central Florida. And one of the very first places picked was this place that we have right here, because of its elevation, because of its soil. And the first gentleman to do so was this guy right here by the name of Bird Pearson. He was an attorney by trade from South Carolina, looking to get into farming and agriculture. He wanted to have what we call today a plantation. This would be a place with a large home where multiple different crops would be raised. He really didn't have much farming experience, but what he did do is he brought with him 35 enslaved people. These lists right here are from the census records of the U.S. government in 1840, and they list those individuals by name, age, and any kind of skill or occupation. What you are looking at here is a document that is treating people as property. This would be like me having a car lot and listing Chevrolets, Buicks, Fords. This is important paperwork because these are human lives that are on here. Men, women, and children. And if you look and go through, over half of these people are under 18. Some are children. Now, from a plantation standpoint, they were used in a variety of factors. They could be used in the fields to clear the lumber and land. They could be used to build the house itself. And initially, Mr. Pearson built a log cabin here. Then later on with plans to build the big home. Many of them are what were called domestics, where they would cook or work in the house. Behind us is what eventually became the kitchen of the house, the annex. So these enslaved people would work in the kitchen with a wood-burning stove. Some would live right above it. Others, right out this window, if you look where the bamboo is today, about 80 yards out that way, there's a historical marker. That is where most of the enslaved people initially had small cabins, right within sight of the house, where they could come and work and, more importantly, be observed by the owners of the plantation, where he knew where everybody was at.
In that little circular area?
Right over, a little to the right, over by the bamboo, straight ahead there,
Oh, okay,
there's
I see
that
it.
sign.
Okay.
And right in that area, several years ago, we've had archaeologists come out here who excavated and found all the spots where these cabins were. And some of them were as small as 12 feet by 10 feet and could house anywhere from 2 to 6 people. And they would work here. Generally, we don't have a lot of the details, but if it was like many other plantations, they generally worked 6 days a week, had Sundays off, or even worked parts of Sunday. And they had their own, basically, social life. It could be as simple as singing and dancing around a cabin, telling stories. Back then, it was actually illegal to teach African Americans how to read and write. Some of them learned on their own anyway, a lot of times through churches, particularly to read the Bible. But in this place, those that were enslaved generally were either working the plantation or the house itself. And in 1847, 5 years after this first man came here, he was asked to be on the state Supreme Court in Tallahassee. He was an attorney by trade, but he was a justice of the peace here locally as a judge. He couldn't come back and forth between Tallahassee and here, so he sold the property, along with the African Americans who were here, to a second owner named Francis Etherington. Etherington himself was also an attorney from the same area of South Carolina, who also had enslaved people.
What part of South Carolina? Do you know?
The Tidewater area, so
Okay.
southeast part, right
Okay.
along the coast.
Okay.
And he himself brought 30 to 35 slaves, in addition to the ones that were already here. And he grew cotton, tobacco, and sugar cane as well. But he created a timber industry, basically cutting the woods around here. He had a mill here on site. They would then process the lumber into boards and ship it all around the country to shipbuilders, home builders, even pencil factories of all things were using wood. And it's Francis Etherington who becomes the owner or builder, of the house that we're in today. He began it in 1847 and was completed around 1851. Now, in the building of the house itself, he used skilled engineers and trained construction people. We believe few of the African Americans were involved in the main construction of the house. That meant they were working the fields, they were working domestically in the kitchen and things like that. Here is where one of the most important stories comes out of this whole place. This lady right here, by the name of...
Where's the,
right in that building, the lower level, right in the gift shop. You're welcome. This is Elizabeth Carr Washington. She came as a 12-year-old slave under Francis Etherington, the second owner. At 12 years old, she was working domestically in the kitchen. She was probably helping to cook, perhaps sew clothing, things that you would do within the house. She lived here eventually over 70 years, earned her freedom in 1865 after the Civil War, went on to become the head cook of the place. Then she was a midwife, where she helped deliver hundreds of children, black and white, here in Hernando County. She became a property owner. She bought 40 acres of land in the late 1800s, early 1900s. One, as a woman, it was difficult to own property in the South, but as an African American woman, it was almost unheard of. She owned 40 acres. In the 20s, she bought an automobile, and she was too old to even drive it, so she had her grandson drive her all around. This is a woman with no formal education, yet incredibly bright, intelligent, was written about fondly by 3 of the 4 families who lived here, because she worked for, over the 70-year span, 3 different families. But this is a woman who had the dignity to overcome bondage, who overcome being a woman at a time when that was difficult enough, but then to become a property owner and raise children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Many of those descendants have gone on to college educations and formal careers. Several still live in the area. She is buried less than a couple miles away at the Lake Lindsay Cemetery right down the road. She is one of the most fascinating stories, and it's deeply personal for me because she worked in the kitchen here initially and lived above it in an apartment. That's my office today, and I didn't know any of this until a few months of working here and doing research. So for me, you feel, I'm not going to say there's ghosts and spirits by any means, but there is something in the area, a feeling, a spirit. And I am sure that it's Elizabeth Carr Washington to me. I've met some of her family and descendants, and she's a fascinating woman. But we have a couple more like that as we come around here. Another story that I want to talk about is a man named Fielder Harris. Fielder was the son of slaves here on the property. And he was old enough to remember slavery, but he grew up as a freedman. And in the 1880s, he lived here on the estate and in the area. And he met a young man named Raymond Robbins. He was the white son of a family from up north who sent him down to live with an aunt and uncle. And Fielder was kind of a jack of all trades. He was an expert carpenter, horseman, farmer, and he befriended this young white boy, Raymond Robbins, at a time when African Americans and whites did not mix socially in the Deep South. It was very frowned upon. And young Raymond considered him like a family member. He taught him about the world, hunting and fishing and riding horses and telling stories. And eventually, this young Raymond graduates from college, becomes an attorney in Chicago, and somehow manages to come down here and buy this with his sister. The house has had several owners. At the time young Raymond was here, a third owner by the name of Joseph Snow was the owner. Now, he bought it after the Civil War, so he did not have slaves here. He did have several African Americans who worked here as paid employees, particularly in citrus. He grew oranges and grapefruit and gave jobs to local African Americans when those were hard to come by in the 1870s and 80s here. Hernando County and Brooksville in general has not always been kind to those of color. It has a long history of social issues for decades, well into the 20th century. But somehow those on this estate have able to create relationships, black and white, that go against the norms here in the Deep South. And Joseph Snow had black employees along with whites, and that wasn't very common. But Raymond Robbins, the fourth and last owner, really went against the grain. He met Fielder as a young man, and when he was an adult and came and bought it, the very first thing that he did is he named Fielder Harris the overseer of the entire plant, the entire farm. That means a black man was in charge of white employees. This was almost unheard of in the Deep South around the turn of the century when this happened. It just was very, very uncommon. The second thing is he did after that is he renamed this place Chinsegut Hill, the name that we have today. Chinsegut is a native Alaskan word, the Inuit Indians of Alaska. Another weird part of the story, Raymond Robbins found his way to Alaska in the Yukon Gold Rush of 1898. The word Chinsegut means spirit of lost things. And he felt that his lost youth spent running in the woods with Fielder Harris and being a good kid, he was able to recapture by moving into this house. He knew the Snow family, he attended events here. So this was a big accomplishment in his early adulthood. And he got it through the help of his sister, Elizabeth. Another part of the story where a powerful woman is involved. Elizabeth, the older sister of Raymond, is what today we would call an A-list Hollywood star. She was a stage actress, very famous one, out of New York and Boston. It's her money that bought this place, almost 2,000 acres in the house. Because Raymond was right out of law school, he didn't have a lot of money. Elizabeth fronts him the money, so she becomes a woman landowner, and automatically one of the biggest landowners in Hernando County. They bought it initially for brother and sister to share and live here together. That was kind of common back then. If you didn't marry, families stayed together, and Raymond and his sister Elizabeth were close. Well, Elizabeth ends up marrying right about the time she buys the house, and so does Raymond. Raymond meets a woman named Margaret Dreyer, who was a German immigrant, and Elizabeth meets a fellow actor named George Parks and gets married. Now, sadly, her husband George killed himself after only a few months of marriage, and she was heartbroken. And add to the fact that she didn't want to get involved in the marital affairs of her brother now that he's married, Elizabeth never lives here permanently after this. They buy her out of her share, but she comes frequently through the years as a guest. More importantly, she becomes more famous as a writer and novelist than she ever was as an actress. And what she wrote about were powerful women's stories for voter rights, called suffrage, for equal treatment of men and women of color. And she became not just a national leader, but an international leader in these things, because she moved to England and lived most of her adult life there, but visiting here a lot. And some of the books that she wrote, over 40 books, some of them were written about her family. They're semi-autobiographical, meaning about her and her family. She wrote some of these books here while visiting. And she used her fame as an actress to improve the lives of other women in the United States and England. You got to remember, in the early part of the 20th century, women could not vote. Many states didn't allow women to own property. Some didn't even go to college. Florida at least had women's schools, allowed women to own property, but they made it difficult. It's through Elizabeth Robbins and later Raymond's wife, Margaret Dreyer, who also is a part of this movement. It took women like that around the world to protest and march and contact their congressmen. And finally, there's an amendment to the Constitution that allows this. Those of us who grew up today in the 20th and 21st century, we take it for granted that anybody over 18 can vote. But back then, women couldn't vote, and certain people of color often had to jump through hoops. Even though the Constitution allowed for them to vote, there were things like taxes, poll taxes, or written tests to keep people from voting. Some southern states, you had to be a property owner, but yet they made it almost impossible to buy property to vote. So these are things that today we almost take for granted, but 100 years ago were very, very uncommon. And these are leaders in these movements, all a part of this house, whether living here or visiting. I'll go back to Raymond's wife, Margaret Dreyer. She was a German immigrant, but came from a very wealthy family. But she was involved in what's called progressive politics today. They were a little more socially different. They wanted all these things that Elizabeth wanted. Rights for women, rights for people of color. She was the national president of two different women's groups for labor rights, and also involved in women's suffrage, and part of that 1919 movement for women vote. So this house is unique in that you have past slaves who become landowners and dignified people. You have not just one, but two powerful, independent women who are part of the same family eventually, but are born apart, who become international leaders. And all here in this little small town of Brooksville in the little county of Hernando. While all this is going on, there's still dramatic tension and problems with whites and blacks. There were lynchings where they hung people for crimes. Some real crimes, some imagined. So socially, there's a lot of history of animosity between the races. I'm going to wrap up in this other room where we can tie all this together and show the importance. Oh, shoot, how can I forget? So we go back to Elizabeth Carr Washington, 12-year-old slave who lives here. This is a picture of her with her husband, George Washington, taken somewhere around the 1870s. That is the smiling daughter right here in this picture. To the left, that same daughter is on the far left, her granddaughter in the middle, and Elizabeth on the right, taken in the 1920s after she's lived here almost 70 years. A lot of character, a lot of work ethic. On the top left is a wonderful photograph. This is a school that was right here on the property, brought here by the U.S. government, by a group called the U.S. Freedmen's Bureau. After the Civil War, to bring opportunities to African American families, they built this school right here on the property to teach the newly freed slaves' children. And the picture on the far right is a typical work day here on the property. This is them cleaning their clothes in the days before machines, where you scrub your clothes literally in a tub of water and dried them in the air. I love how it shows the clothes hanging in the bushes in the sun to dry. That was labor, a lot of work. And we're lucky today that we have machinery that does an awful lot of this. But here we're blessed to have two photographs showing 3 generations of women here at Chinsegut Hill who were affected deeply by their upbringing, their backgrounds. And Elizabeth Carr Washington eventually had great-grandchildren living here in the area as well. So 4 generations of Carrs and Washingtons. It's a fabulous story.
Wow.
Now, as we go across, I want to talk a little bit more, once again, about Fielder Harris, the man who becomes the supervisor of this whole place. To have an African-American man in charge of white employees at this time in the early 20th century was not only almost unheard of, it was dangerous. And Fielder was an outdoorsman. He was a man that wasn't afraid of people. But neither was Raymond Robbins. Raymond, right here behind me, a picture of him right out of college after he became an attorney. When he named the place Chinsegut Hill, he hired that man right here, Fielder, to become the overseer. And this is his family, his wife and 2 children, to demonstrate the bond between Raymond Robbins and the Harris family. Raymond built him this modest house and barn right here on the property, about 100 yards out that window. It was burned by an arsonist who was upset that a black man was in charge. Raymond, not to be intimidated, kept him on and warned anybody else there'll be bigger problems if you try to do anything else. Fielder, out of gratitude, named his son Raymond and his daughter Margaret after the Robbins family here. That's how close they were. Raymond later on took Fielder Harris all around the country, to Washington, D.C., to New York City, and he introduced him to important, powerful people like Teddy Roosevelt, the former president. He took him to Washington, D.C., to Congress. And we have photographs of Fielder smiling in a beautiful custom black suit and hat, proud to be walking around and meeting these people. And Raymond didn't introduce him as my employee. He introduced Carr Washington. And I use these terms, aunt and uncle, because they're the terms they used back then in their writings. Today, aunt and uncle can be construed as derogatory. Especially if a wife, like Aunt Jemima or Uncle Tom, it can be misconstrued. To them, then, it was a term of endearment. They truly thought of them as parts of the family. And Fielder and Elizabeth both were important parts of the Robbins family here. But Elizabeth Carr Washington was definitely a product of the Deep South in her times. She smoked a pipe. She dipped snuff and walked around barefoot everywhere. but yet had a powerful mind and a work ethic that not only gave her survival, but she thrived at a time when other people weren't. We have a very powerful letter that I like to keep out for people to read. This was written in 1907, right after Fielder's house was burned. And this is a friend of Raymond's. Raymond's out of town on business when this arson happens. His friend writes this letter to say, I'm so sorry to have to tell you what that meant was somebody locally hated him. And